Yellow and Red Makes by Digits 27, Chapter 9. As he took in the sight before him, Naruto's inner skeptic couldn't help but comment, for a hidden village Tsunagakure really stuck out from the surrounding flatlands, easily spotted from miles away. In fact, it was an awe-inspiring sight, comparable with Konoha's famous North Gate. The mighty stone walls rose up like cliff faces on either side of a narrow passageway, barely wide enough for three men to walk down side by side. Kyubi told him that it was the only entrance in or out of the village, or at least the only obvious way, as there were bound to have hidden routes in ninja villages. There were also protective seals on the surfaces of the impressive wall designs to stop any chakra-based maneuvers that might help enemy ninjas scale the walls. Not only that, but the defenses themselves were staggered upwards with a daunting array of Suna ninja constantly alert and ready for any hint of invasion or infiltration. The entire sight from up close was enough to make both children gulp with anxiety. They walked up, both desperately fighting both their bodies' natural urge to tremble when faced with such an overwhelming show of military prowess. Naruto quickly realized that the village hidden in the sand easily lived up to both of its monikers. There was certainly a lot of sand. The discomfort in his shoes told him as much. The desert surrounding them acted as almost the initial layer of defense for the village, and keeping out all but the most determined would-be visitors or attackers. Few would bother trying to find the village if they didn't already know where to look, and the size of the desert combined with the locations of the oasis made it impossible for any enemy to reach it conveniently. It was only because of Naruto's heightened smell and Kyubi's directions that they were even able to make it here without a map. Without one, or the other way, or the other, they could have spent weeks wandering the desert, or simply have died from dehydration long ago. The thought brought another gulp to Naruto's throat as he began approaching what appeared to be the ninja guarding the entrance. He was an average-sized person with the white veil that seemed practically mandatory for many Suna residents. One could immediately tell that this was a job that the man had been in for years and had lost interest in not long ago. After he received the position, he was stuck in a twilight state of tuning that never quite reached Jonin and ended up with the same eternal menial task. Of course, for two 7-year-olds, that fact was lost, and the imposing man lost none of his intimidating factor. If anything, the bored manner with which he carried out the job only added to it. He narrowed his eyes when he saw two solitary children approach him, seemingly from out of the desert itself. He peered harder and tried to find the adults that must be with them, but when that failed, he just stared at them, wondering if the desert heat had finally gotten to him. When he realized he wasn't, in fact, seeing things, he looked over the children more carefully. Once he did, he realized that they each carried packs as if they had been on a long hike. For them to actually be here, that must have been true. He was about to address them and ask what their business was, still in disbelief about just what he was seeing, when a higher ranked sensor nin dropped down from the defense layer above him. He quickly sprinted towards the gate guard as Naruto and Tagiya watched on with both anticipation and slight concern. The new arrival would occasionally throw fleeting glances their way when he whispered to the first guard. Once he was finished, he took one more look at the pair, or more specifically, Naruto, and then vanished in a blur. Sand lightly floating down from where he had been standing. The original guard coughed loudly and was once again joined by another sand shinobi, this time being the one whispering into the other's ear. Naruto was starting to become highly anxious, and even though he didn't say anything, he knew Taiyo was feeling the same way from the way she reached over and took his hand lightly. He knew she mustn't have even realized she was doing it. She wasn't exactly the hand-holding type. The first ninja finished and returned to lazily leaning against the passage wall, keeping an eye on the horizon. The newest guard quickly walked over, slightly scaring the pair as he made a beeline directly towards them. The new arrival was similar to the first guard in that he was of average height and size, but instead of the more traditional veil, his whole head was wrapped up in linen bandages, so only his nose and eyes were showing. I have been instructed to bring you straight to the Kasakage. Please follow me. He said nothing more as he quickly turned on a heel and started walking down the tight passageway. Stunned there for a few moments, Naruto just stared after the man, as did Tagiya. Sensing this, the ninja turned and gave the two a look that said he wasn't going to wait for very long. That was sufficient in snapping the pair out of the shock-induced paralysis and they very quickly hurried after the man, barely keeping up with his long strides. Past the intimidating outer wall, the children could breathe a sigh of relief before taking another sharp intake of air as they looked around the village proper. It was a beautiful sight to behold. The buildings themselves seemed to rise out of the very land itself, taking abstract and often intricate forms, whilst everything seemed to be made out of the same beige stone that didn't stop each building from managing its own individuality. Banners and bright colored ornaments hung from windows and walls. Each opening in the walls, so be they balcony or window, emitted the warm glow of a lived in home. Even the shops could be easily distinguished with their various wares and means of advertising proudly displayed, ready to catch the eye or nose of any passerby. In a way, it was exactly the same as Konoha, the same spirit and energy. In other words, it was completely different. The alien architecture and fashions of the people, to name a few, they made sure to stick close to the guiding ninja. His long and fast strides meant they almost had to jog to keep in line with him. Suddenly he stopped, almost making Naruto bump into him from behind, but he managed to catch himself. The reason soon became clear when another sand ninja appeared in a swirl of dust, and the two talked inanimately. Naruto tried to be patient, but that was hardly in his personality. Soon he began to fidget, and not long after that, he started to look around. They seemed to have moved into a less densely populated area of the village. Large, large formations of rock rose up erratically, and the entire area seemed to be some kind of playground. The group of children were running, playing a game with a ball that Naruto recognized but never learned the name of. He smiled. Now that he was here, maybe he could join in with them. Maybe he could have the fun that they appeared to be having in if their joyous cries were anything to go on. As the ninja escorting them continued to talk to the latest newcomer, Naruto watched the game transfixed, trying to learn how it worked. He was just beginning to understand that it had something to do with getting the ball to one of the two ends of the field before one of the kids kicked the ball slightly too hard. It shot away from the group, bouncing away to one side. It rolled, coming to a stop at the feet of a small child standing next to a set of swings. Naruto looked at him for a moment as the boy hesitantly picked up the escaped ball. He was small, smaller than Naruto, but they were obviously around the same age. His spiky red hair sat in a mop on his head, not dissimilar to Naruto's own hair. He wore a beige wrap around his upper body and shoulders and a pair of darker shorts with plain sandals. In his other hand, he clutched a stuffed toy, which Naruto noticed looked particularly worn from age. The child approached the large group almost as tentatively as he had picked up the ball itself. After a moment of what seemed like self-deliberation, he held the ball out to the other kids with a meek smile. The reaction he got wasn't at all what Naruto was expecting. The children seemed terrified of the boy, pointing and nervously whispering amongst themselves. When he took another step forward, it was the final straw. The children took off, screaming and crying in fear of him. Even more unexpected was what happened after that. The smaller boy extended his hand almost lonely, tears openly streaming down his face, as if in reaction to the boy's torment. The very sand at his feet writhed and moved before shooting out and snaring the foot of the child that had originally kicked the ball towards him. Naruto was moving before he fully understood what was happening himself, his body just working on instinct. He arrived just in time to block the powerful stream of sand that was aimed directly at the ponytailed boy on the floor. Naruto's arms were crossed over his chest protectively, bleeding from the mass of sand that had hit him. The boy behind him took the chance to scramble to his feet and sprint away, not even glancing behind him at the boy who had saved him from injury. The red-haired boy, from his part, looked on at Naruto with dread. He was still crying, and he took that moment to turn and run. He accidentally dropped the bear he had been holding so that he could bring his arms up and attempt to wipe the tears from his eyes. Naruto wasn't sure what to think. The boy had seemingly controlled the sand through his will alone, yet at the same time his face easily showed he was just as frightened when it happened as the boy he had inadvertently attacked. Naruto looked down at the discarded bear and towards the fleeting form of the boy, and that was all it took to make up his mind. He grabbed the bear as he ran, determined to catch up to him and get some answers. It was difficult. The kid knew Suna better than Naruto did, and he almost lost him a few times, but luckily he eventually found him. He was hunched over at the end of the darkest part of an alleyway. The only indication that he was there at all were the quiet sobs coming from the shadows. Naruto approached cautiously. He easily discerned the small boy's form from the surrounding darkness in his eyes and walked straight up to him. The boy took a moment out of his crying to look up at Naruto. It seemed he had a little difficulty seeing Naruto as Naruto did him. Naruto held out his hand. In it, the boy's discarded bear. When he did nothing, Naruto moved closer, still with the bear held out between them. The red-haired boy just looked at him with wide, tear-stained eyes, disbelieving almost. He even rubbed them once, as if he believed Naruto would simply vanish as a hallucination. "Why don't you run like the others?" Naruto smiled as kindly as he could as the boy finally accepted the bear, clutching it close to his chest like it was his own mother. Naruto walked a little bit closer and sat down opposite him. "Your eyes." The boy looked startled, but no less hesitant or disbelieving. A finger moved up to his eyes and lightly traced around the thick black lines that encircled it. My eyes?" Naruto nodded slowly, his smile taking on a more somber and saddened look, one that he had no difficulty in dredging up as he looked back over his past. "Our eyes are the same." The boy seemed to peer into Naruto's eyes for what seemed like an eternity, searching for what it was the boy meant. You, you have it too." He turned away, looking to the ground. "The loneliness and the pain." Naruto nodded again, still slowly. He didn't want to startle the boy. "Why do they run from you?" First, the other boy looked up in shock, like he just expected Naruto to know, and even if he didn't, he still saw the display earlier. The sand. Naruto firmly shook his head, cutting him off before he could finish. "You're trying to help them and giving them back their ball. Why did they run?" The other boy seemed almost desperate now. He was having a conversation with somebody his own age. He felt like if he told him the truth, he would lose his one shred of normality. Sensing his discomfort, Naruto tried something else. This boy had intrigued him. There was something about him like an instinctive bond between the two, like they could relate on some unseen level. "I'm Naruto Uzumaki." The other boy looked up, visibly relieved at the change in conversation. "Gara no Subaku." Naruto smiled slightly, brightly. The warmth he emitted encouraged Gara to try his own weaker smile. Before the conversation could develop any further, they were interrupted by a swirl of dust that deposited the ninja guide from earlier and frightened Taiya. I told you to follow me." And mid-sentence, the guard saw the other occupant of the alley and took an instinctual step back. "Gara, I did not know you were here." He thought for a moment. "I was given orders to bring you to your father if I saw you." Gara nodded meekly, but the smile that Naruto had given him just managed to stay where it was. The older ninja walked over, and when the three children were all around him, he made a hand sign, and the four of them disappeared in a swirl of dust. Naruto had never experienced destruction before, and it was disorienting to say the least. Immediately, he lost his sense of balance and would have fallen over if it weren't for the firm hand on his shoulder. It seemed the older ninja wasn't taking any chances on losing his charge again. After a moment of confusion and his senses catching up to his location, Naruto realized he was in an area that was unfamiliar to him. They were in an office of sorts, built out of the same stone as the rest of the village, but lavishly furnished. Despite the lush walls and floor, the desk that was the center of the room was rather plain, just a normal rectangular wooden desk. Even so, it managed to convey the importance of the man sitting behind it. It was a thin but well-built man with shaggy auburn hair, not dissimilar from Gara's. He wore a black collared shirt with a mesh shirt underneath. He maintained a perfect look of indifference as his eyes lazily but attentively moved over the four entries. "Gara, wait outside. I will speak with you later." His voice was calm, but there was an inevitable authority behind the words that spoke of his importance. Gara nodded weakly and timidly walking out of the room with his head hung low, red hair falling across his eyes as he did so. The ninja who had escorted Naruto and Tagiya this far took that as an opportunity to walk up to the man. By now, Naruto had recognized that this was the Kazekage, evidenced by the white robes and green trimmed hat that hung on the wall. Once he made his realization, he bowed his head down low. Earlier he had run away from his guide, and right now he didn't want to cause any more of a disturbance. This was his fresh start, and he wouldn't let anything ruin it, not even himself. Taiya just looked across at him, furrowed her brow at the odd behavior. She didn't have the benefit of having known Akage personally, and didn't fully understand the position she was in. The side of the Kazekage's mouth twitched up into a small smile, amused by the small child bowing to him. "That is not necessary, Naruto Uzumaki." Naruto raised his head slowly, the worry evident in his eyes. "How did you know my name?" The Kazekage merely smiled again in the exact same way. I am the Yondaime Kasukage. There's nothing in this village that I cannot find out. Seeing Naruto's slightly odd expression, he chuckled rather humorlessly. If you must know, the ninja that escorted you heard you say your name when you introduced yourself to my son. Naruto let out a slight sheepish smile while rubbing the back of his head, the unspoken tension in the room finally broken. The Kasukage leaned forward in his chair, with his elbows resting on the sturdy desk and his hands forming a pyramid as he peered closer to the younger boy. I am not one for small talk, nor long drawn out conversations. I had you brought here because one of my sensor nin detected the presence of a strange chakra signature. His glance flickered between the two children. That would either make you enemy ninjas that are hinged or under some kind of genjutsu. His stare hardened and seemed to rest on the both of them simultaneously, causing both children to go up audible. Or one of you is a Jinchuriki. He's talking about you, kid. A Jinchuriki is one who bears a biju sealed within them. Naruto nodded in understanding, drawing a curious glance from the Kasukage, who took the nod as a sign that he was correct. Interesting. If I may ask, which of the tailed beasts do you contain? Naruto looked at the man nervously, even as a growl rolled through his mind. I hate that name. It's almost as bad as demon. Naruto just laughed timidly, unsure what to do. You may as well tell him, kid. He is the leader of this place and will not hesitate to kill you if he deems it necessary. The nine-tailed fox, Kyubi. The Kasukage's eyes widened for a moment, and his features gained a broad grin as he took in the news. A child is the Jinchuriki of the most powerful entity since the Jubi itself. Naruto nodded, not fully understanding the words the old man was saying. A story from another time, kids. Right now, you have more urgent things to hear. Once again, he heard the pang of melancholy in the Kyubi's voice. It just sounded out of place. By now, the Kasukage's attention was solely focused on Naruto. He felt the heat of the man's gaze as he searched him for any signs of deceit. Last I heard, the Kyubi was under Konoha's control, so why are you here? Naruto became nervous again, unsure of what telling the truth might bring him. On the one hand, he still didn't want to do anything to jeopardize his new life. On the other, he worried that if people here found out about his past, then it would all just repeat itself. I had to leave. He left it at that. It was vague but completely honest, the best of both scenarios. The Kazekage hardly seemed satisfied, but he still had many questions, the most important immediately coming to mind. What is the relationship you share with the demon sealed inside of you? You know of it, and it hardly seemed like Konoha told you, considering what happened to their village 7 years ago. Naruto immediately sent a questioning thought to the Kyubi, who stayed mysteriously silent despite the demon remark. I assume you have had contact with the demon yet. You seem healthy enough. Does this mean you are in control of it? Again, Naruto wasn't sure of how to answer. The question seemed to come non-stop, and it took him a moment to catch up. I wouldn't say that. We have more of a, he briefly searched for the right word, an understanding. It appeared that this wasn't the answer that the Kasakage had hoped for. However, it still seemed that it was good enough, and he nodded with his face set back in its previous indifferent state. My son Gara is like you, the Jinchuriki of the One Tails, Shukaku. Unlike you, his demon torments him, stops him from sleeping, and if this carries on, I fear I will have to kill my son before he gets out of hand. Naruto could have cried out in protest if Kyubi hadn't quickly shushed him from inside his head. He didn't know if the sound was laced by something, but it had an immediate calming effect. I wish for you to help Garo control the demon within him, befriend him, train him, beat him if you must. Under his breath, he muttered, or can, then carried on with his normal tone. But I wish for him to at least gain the same control that you do, he sighed heavily. If that is not the case by this time next year, I will unfortunately have to go through with my original plan. Again, Naruto wanted to cry out, and again, Kyubi calmed him quickly. You will live with us in the Kasakage mansion. There are plenty of spare rooms so that he shot a glance at Takuya, who had miraculously stayed perfectly quiet throughout the entire encounter. Companion can stay as well. He gave one last nod, and the ninja who had encountered them before materialized between the two startled children. The Kasakage waved absently with his hand, and the Sen Shinobi gave a curt nod before leaving the two out of the office. Once outside, Naruto released the breath he hadn't even realized he had been holding. Takuya seemed equally relieved when he glanced over to her. Next, turned his attention to the small red head that was now nervously looking over the trio, still desperately clutching his bear. Gaara looked so dejected. Naruto had noticed it as soon as the Kasakage had spoken to him, the shame and loneliness that emanated from him in the older man's presence. Naruto's eyes hardened at the thought, and before their escort could do anything, he walked over to Gaara in 2 strides. Hi, Gaara. The redhead had been staring at the floor before now, but was looking with wide eyes into Naruto's face. He had still been puzzling out their earlier confrontation, on some level believing that it was all some hallucination or another cruelty brought on him by the creature living inside of him. Naruto smiled, sensing the nervousness of the smaller boy, and tried to do everything in his power to ease his troubled mind. I think we're going to be friends now. Gaara just kept staring at him with wide black rimmed eyes, which Naruto had only properly noticed for the first time. He wondered if they were like his whisker marks, but filed away the thought for later. Friends, Naruto nodded cheerfully, and after a moment of hesitation, Gaara smiled. It was meek and timid, but it was an improvement over before. Their escort had been patient up until now, but he had been given orders by his Kasukage, and he would fulfill them. Gaara, your father will see you now. As for you two, he motioned with his hand for Naruto to draw closer, and didn't finish his sentence as he firmly placed the same hand on Naruto's shoulder. He still wasn't used to how the world just suddenly blurred, but having already experienced it once, he could at least prepare himself. In a few seconds, he was in a new, completely unfamiliar environment, much to both his and Tayuya's annoyance. Kankuro! Temari! Naruto cringed at the unexpected outburst from their otherwise stoic and reserved escort, but didn't have time for it as suddenly he heard the rush of feet in their direction. A boy rounded the door first. He was obviously older than Naruto by maybe a year or two. He had hair similar to Gaara's in style, but was a dark brown in color. He wore a deep black shirt that seemed many sizes too big for him, as it went down to nearly his knees. He was hooded, but the cloth was pulled back to rest against his neck right now. Next to enter the room at a slightly more sedated pace was a girl older than the boy. She had sandy blonde hair that was tied up in a long ponytail that swayed behind as she walked. Like the boy, she wore clothing that seemed impractically large for her, a white shirt that seemed more like a dress, especially considering she wore nothing below it, tied up with a red sash. Yes, Baki-sensei. It was the older girl who spoke, even as she curiously glanced over the two children next to him. The boy beside her was less tactful, openly staring at the two with his eyes narrowed, trying to figure out what was going on. I'm only here to inform you that these two will be staying here for a while. Temari, the Kasukage has instructed you to show them around before letting them to retire to the rooms nearest Gaara's. The girl that Naruto now knew was called Temari nodded hesitantly while the boy narrowed his eyes further. Why? Bucky sent a glare the boy's way, but it was completely lost on his otherwise occupied form. Because Kankuro, your father has ordered it. The tone was absolute, enough to get Kankuro to turn slowly and nod apologetically. Yes, I'm sorry, Bucky-sensei. Bucky nodded approvingly before sparing one last glance around at the four children. A tired sigh managed to escape his lips as he quickly ushered away, already expecting what was about to happen. All four children watched the swirl of dust and sand until it disappeared before blue and green eyes met black and dark blue. The tension in the room was palpable to the point where Naruto swore the single bead of sweat rolling down his cheek could actually be heard as it arduously made its way across his cheek. So, Temari's attempt to break the silence only increased its awkwardness. Luckily, this was one time in Naruto's life that he could honestly say his brash and unfront nature was a help as opposed to a hindrance. Hi, I'm Naruto Uzumaki, and this. He motioned across at Tayuya, who still had yet to say a word since entering the Kasukage's office. Is Tayuya? The tension finally broke. Temari had finally broken. Temari smirked evilly. Had broken Temari. She smirked evilly, but didn't say a word. Kankuro had settled back into glaring at the two younger children. So Naruto, mind explaining why we're going to be living together for the foreseeable future? It was said flippantly, but there was no hiding the underlying curiosity and ever so slightly hostility beneath the words. Temari proceeded to show the two around the surprisingly large and roomy mansion that the Kasukage called home. As he exclaimed what had happened, he noticed the look of unease that passed over the sibling's face when he mentioned he was a Jinchuriki but made nothing of it. Once the tour was over, Temari brought the pair to a long corridor of bedrooms before showing Naruto into one he later found out was next to Gaara's. Tayuya was just across the hall from his. Naruto had found that he liked Temari. She was naturally upbeat, much like himself, even if she could be slightly scary at times. He also found out the reason for Kankuro's distrust in that he was extremely protective of his little brother and harbored a natural resentment to people of his own age group. Once he heard the story of how Naruto had met Gaara, that distrust started to slip, but he was still a bit distant out of habit. Even so, Kankuro awed him slightly when he broke off from the group only to return slightly later with a large wooden puppet. He had tinkered with it the entire time they walked, and Tamara had grown increasingly frustrated with his one-word replies to her questions. Naruto quickly figured that this was a reoccurring argument, and he envied them for having that sibling relationship. The tour ended there, and Tamara left the young boy to his own devices as she escorted a still nervous-looking Tayuya out and across the hall to her own room. Kankuro stayed behind, watching the two girls leave as well before turning to Naruto and giving him an appraised look. If you're living here, I expect father will have you training as a shinobi. Naruto was little shocked. Apart from his outburst in front of Baki, this was the first time he had actually said anything to Naruto. If I know my father, he won't waste any time. Get a good night's sleep and be up early tomorrow. He started walking out of the room, but called back over his shoulders. Because it's the last chance you'll get for a few years. Naruto could practically feel the smirk that radiated off of the boy as he left, and he fought back. And he fought back one of his own. Turning, Naruto made his own appraisal of the room. It was incredible. This one room alone was the size of his apartment back in Konoha, and that wasn't even counting the ensuite bathroom that he could see from here. The majority of one corner was taken up by a large bed with beige sheets and darker pillows. There was also a large window which gave him a breathtaking view of Sunagakure that immediately reminded him of the view from atop the Hokage monument, even if the landscape itself was drastically different. After just looking out at the place he was going to be calling home from now on, Naruto released a contented sigh along with a warm smile. Quickly, it developed into a mischievous grin as he ran and launched himself onto the bed, reveling in the feeling as the non-rusty springs launched him back into the air. He landed in a laughing heap, snuggling closer into the soft mattress and grabbing a pillow to hold like Gaara did his bear. Before he hadn't felt all that tired, but a yawn broke past his lips. He shrugged. Obviously, the tour had taken longer than he thought, although he wasn't surprised considering the sheer size of the building. So what do you think, QB? He heard a chuckle from his mind. I think that I was right. She chuckled again as she felt his quizzical look shoot introspectively at her. I was right to tell you to leave the village, don't you think? Naruto nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess you were, but I was actually talking about Gaara. Do you think we can help him? QB growled lowly. The Jinchuriki of Shukaku, so disdainful. Sensing the hostility from Naruto, she sighed. He was far too helpful for his own good. My answer, though, is yes, we should be able to help him. I'll slap some sense into the Tanuki. Just don't expect immediate results, as this might take some time. She sighed again, but it seemed to be more personal reasons. Honestly, I think I should have done something about his damnable bloodlust before now. Father would be so ashamed. Before Naruto had time to question her, he heard his door open and a familiar scent enter his room. He smiled as he sat up, looking at Tayuya, who just stared at him awkwardly before walking up and climbing under the covers with him. He looked at her questioningly, and she just stared back, willing him to say anything before her shoulders drooped slightly. It's fucking cold in this house. She would be damned to admit that it was because she had grown used to his presence curled up next to her as she slept, just as she would be damned to say that this whole experience left her feeling vulnerable and meek, and that he was the only familiar thing she had to hold on to right now. Naruto said nothing, just as content to let his arm fall into its usual position around Tayuya's waist. By now, she thought nothing of it. What have you got us into? She yawned, but it didn't let that. But that. But didn't let. But that didn't let. But didn't let that stop her finishing her sentence. Shithead, she sighed, and as she said it, her eyelids drooping wearily before they closed, and she was out like a light. Naruto smiled, equally tired, and allowed the soft bed and other equally soft body lull him to sleep, of course, foregoing his usual lesson. His dreams were filled with thoughts of the future, what life in Suna would bring to him, now that he had friends. End of chapter 9.